10 minutes, or the students give us 10 minutes of grace period before we're late. No, the students give us 10. If a professor doesn't show up in the first 15 minutes, they can leave.
Academic quarter.
Academic, yeah. Well, of course, but that never works that way. I just introduced a new pop. Oh, well, I reminded them of something, right? So.
It looks like kind of universal rules.
So, thank you everyone for coming and continuing to come to stream in. My name is Aspet Kochikan. I'm from the Political Science program. Today, we are going to have a panel discussion about the continuous sort of regional, international problematic issue about the conflict, war in Ukraine. We are lucky to have two experts from Russia, Sergei Makedonov, who's here, as well as or foresight, some people would say, to have a panel on the day of the war, the day that the war broke out. We had a panel discussion. Among the discussants were Professor Dermatevosyan, as well as Nigorosyan, Professor Nigorosyan, and we were talking about suddenly our discussion changed. And since then, and even before that, we had the opportunity here to invite scholars, ambassadors, policymakers to talk about their perspective on what was happening in Ukraine, the future, and so on. We had the Swedish ambassador, the Dutch ambassador, as well as EU-US ambassadors talking in passing also about the conflict and the war. And today we're lucky to have people, scholars, rather than policy makers, although there is a thin line between the two, I think. But scholars to have a discussion about Russian perspective about this. As an institution of higher education, believing in Western, highest standards of Western sort of education, we value freedom of speech, we value listening to others, and even though some people might have expressed concerns about this event, but I kept remembering and usually using the quote from Evelyn Beatrice Hall, who was a writer who wrote a book on the Friends of Voltaire, wrongfully attributed to Voltaire what he said in 1907. But in the book, the fictional Voltaire says, "I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." We set by example, and again, this is a great opportunity to listen, to hear from the horse's mouth in a way about what are some of the thoughts regionally as well as globally in terms of what is motivation in Russia or Russian policy. Each speaker, Sergei, Alexei, and Hovannes will have about 10 minutes of introductory remarks, the thesis sort of, after which we'll have a discussion among the panelists, and after which we're going to open up for a Q&A. That having said, the floor is yours, Sergei.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. First of all, let me start my presentation with the words of sincere gratitude to your university in general, to Professor Aspet Kochikan in particular. Of course, I also would like to express my gratitude to the Russian House of Science and Culture, who ensured me this travel. And why am I here? Because I suppose, and it's my sincere identification, sincere opinion, that now we face a clear lack of dialogues. We follow our own monologues, own narratives, be it Russian or American. And you quoted Voltaire in the initial part of our conversation today, but now it's rarity. These words are not so popular. And monopolization of truth is requested. I have only 10 minutes, however, my topic on dynamics of Ukrainian crisis and conflict requires at least series of articles, maybe a couple of monographs or dozens of monographs. But I try to underline some aspects of this process. First, let's start with definition. If we started quoting well-known distinguished philosophers, René Descartes said that first we should underline our terminology. Why did I choose crisis, conflict, not war? Of course, I am not denying warfare in Ukraine. I understand that now we see the biggest military confrontation in Europe after 1945, under the end of World War II, in terms of number of people engaged in this confrontation, in terms of risks, in terms of consequences, because this crisis is not only about Ukraine or bilateral relations between Russia and Ukraine, Moscow and Kiev. It's about world order and rules of this order. Value of this conflict is significant. However, if we use war, it means we should start our description, our consideration since February 24, 2022. But it's not true, because every warfare has its own roots and developments. Can we consider 8 years between start of so-called anti-terrorist operation proclaimed by Kiev and 2022 like peaceful events? Of course, no. We faced 8 years of warfare in Ukraine, and the number of people killed in this confrontation was about 15,000. Many people now say this number is rather modest in comparison of current days. Excuse me, this number is compared, it's practically the same as the number of victims in the Soviet operation, Soviet engagement in Afghanistan for 10 years. The total number of two regions in Donbass was about 4.5 million, but two of them became refugees. It's 2 times bigger than number of refugees in the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict, 10 times bigger than number of refugees in Abkhazia. And of course, the risks, the value of the problem is bigger. This is why I offer to use the model of multi-layered or multi-sliced model to this conflict. Because at least we should take into the account that everything did not start in February 24, 2022. A lot of prerequisites existed previously, exaggerated that confrontation. And I offer you to consider the Ukrainian crisis and problem as a multi-sliced or multi-layered phenomenon. When Ukraine appeared on the map, well-known theorists of international relations and historians of international relations, American scholar, maybe you know him, Barry Posen, not Mersheimer. Mersheimer is the most beloved, quoted person in Russia. But I would like to, right now and some years ago also, Barry Posen, who said that appearance of Ukraine could be comparable in terms of consequences and impacts with unification of Germany. Why? Because we got in 1991 December the second biggest country in Europe in terms of territory. That time, 5th country in terms of population in Europe, now 8th. Rate is 8th in Europe. However, country having access to the Azov Sea, Black Sea, very important in terms of agricultural development. And don't forget, till 1994 Ukraine was nuclear power. There were 4 new nuclear powers, because we discussed newly independent countries after 1991, after dissolution of the USSR, but 4 of them were new nuclear power, claiming to have their own vector. And Ukraine was the most stubborn country, discussing the problem of non-proliferation and so on. Moreover, the most problematic discussions took place between Americans and Ukrainians. This is why the problem of this country was how to keep sustainability, predictability, stability in this region, how to keep more or less reliable partnership with Russia, the biggest neighbor of this country, and some other Western countries, having also their own problematic relations with Russia, be it Poland, Romania, then Czechoslovakia, then after 1993, Czech Republic, Hungary, and so on, so on. How to keep this stability. And the problem of Ukraine, of course, not artificial character of this power. Very popular idea in my country, among some specific circles, because we can find a lot of artificial countries. Let's see on Germany, after Prussian-French War, it was also a little bit artificial, yeah? Belgium, Italy. When Italy appeared, the first prime minister of this country, Camilla Cavour, said, we established Italy, now we should establish Italians. Ukraine faced maybe not the same, yeah, there were similar problems. But the problem of Ukraine was mixed identity in this country. Because various parts of this country belong to different sovereignties. Nowadays, we see an interesting phenomenon in the Western analytical approach to Ukraine. Most of people claim to be constructivists, saying primordialism is about the Soviet legacy, Stalin's legacy, and so on. However, many persons who claim to be constructivists, like Paul Robert Magochi, for example, John Paul Himka, try to be primordialist scholars who said, yeah, Ukraine was established in 1991, but since Khmelnytsky's time, Ukraine was, how to say, consistent champion how to escape of Russia, and so on and so on. But it was not true. A lot of different parts of Ukraine belong to different sovereignty. This is why a lot of mixed identities. It's the first layer of the problem. As a result, in all the domestic crises after 1991, different parts of this country looked at different vectors, Russian, Western, and so on. The second level of this problem is Russian-Ukrainian relations. It's not only about our cultural kinship and so on. A lot of interdependencies, at least. Now I am not going to ensure a detailed way. Maybe you would raise some questions. But in terms of economic development, especially military-industrial complex, Russia was dependent on Ukraine in many aspects. Till 2015, till 2017, for example, details from helicopters, atomic reactors, or for example, details for air and space equipment, and so on, or transition of oil, till 2017. And third level, last not the least, international. Because in 2013, on the eve of the Second Maidan, I was in Brussels, been engaged in the discussion on the rising crisis in Ukraine. I said that time that choice between European Union and Russia looked like choice between mother and father. Sometimes people face this choice, but it's not a good choice, by the way. The problem of Ukraine is rejection from diversified multi-vector policy, neutrality, and so on. They try to play for right side of the history, supporting only the Western vector, ignoring mixed identity in this country, ignoring fact that many Ukrainians, many people with Ukrainian, not Russian passports, prefer to see Russia as the best guarantor of security, stability, economic development. Let's see on Crimea. Many people, especially in the West, try to restrict the analysis by the fact of annexation. Judicially, yeah, we can trace a lot of manifestations of it. However, let's see on military forces of Ukraine deployed in this peninsula. 19,000. 12,000 of them preferred Russian loyalty in 2014 in the period of one of the hottest domestic crises in this country. People with blue passports, not Russian red passports. Let's see on Donbass. Now I am quoting figures represented by Ukrainian side, not Russian. 40,000 of people engaged in Ministry of Interior, other law enforcement agencies preferred Donbass de facto republics, not Ukraine. Let's see on leaders of Donetsk and Lugansk. Not all of them are delegates of Vladimir Putin, sending him directly from Moscow. Let's see on leader of for example, Luhansk Republic, Mr. Pasechnik, who was officer of Ukrainian Special Services prior to 2014. This is why we had real collapse, real problems, real splits, a lot of split decision inside, which were exploited by external actors. But the key issue was sustainability inside the country. Because if country is more or less sustainable, if country is interested how to improve relations inside one identity, it can keep off engagement of external actors. It's very important. And of course, I understand that my time is, is finished. At least I am repeating. I can devote one monograph or series of articles of it, but I am open for your questions, comments, even criticism. Thank you.
Your time for the initial comments is finished, not all. Don't worry about it, because we're going to come back.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thank
Sergey. It is important to keep the issue of definitions. As Sergey mentioned, in a war can be part of a larger conflict, and the definition of when a war or when a conflict started and so on is an issue. One of the best case scenarios is probably the Chinese-Japanese War since the 1930s, but it was never considered part of the Second World War until the war erupted in Europe. So one could always argue that the Second World War started in 1930s, but it didn't hit home until Europe was involved. A very Eurocentric perspective, of course. Artificiality, speaking about artificiality, again, you also provided it. I was writing it, but then you also said primordialism. In that sense, all states are artificial. There are no, sort of primordial, pre-existing states, or nations for that matter, but that's a different discussion to have. And I love the analogy that you made about, the choice between the mother and the father. But sometimes, for the sake of the child, both parents have to agree that one of the children, or the children have to go with one of the parents. But this is, again, something we can continue discussing in our second round. Alexei is with us now. He managed to beat Yerevan traffic and be here.
Not traffic, but cats and dogs raining.
Yes, both. So,
Exactly.
Again, the floor is yours, Alexei. You have 10 minutes. I will give you a 2-minute warning, and then we'll continue with discussion afterwards.
But first of all, I need the presentation.
Yes.
And the clicker.
Can we use this, yeah?
Yeah. So, there is this that you can use this
There
afterwards.
is no clicker. Yeah?
Huh?
There is no clicker.
There is a clicker.
There's maybe one question to Sergey.
Yeah, we can start the
Presentation
discussion
is being
between.
set up, that will save time.
Go ahead.
No, I'm not going to ask
Oh,
a
yeah.
question now, but maybe the students do have a question.
I suppose you have
To
got a
save
question.
time, to
Yes.
save time. I do have questions, but I do not want to go ahead.
See, that's why we put you on the panel, Hovannes, so that you are limited in asking questions. Rather, you have 10 minutes.
You know me, I always give space to students, so if any of our students has a question.
Anything
now is
that,
the time
to just save time, something to also not just questions but thoughts that could stimulate our discussion in a bit.
I know Professor Nikogosyan at least since 2010, yeah, but previously also we met a couple of times.
That's true.
I was a visiting fellow at CSIS replacing him. He left CSIS the next day. I arrived and started my fellowship.
All good times, huh?
Yes, another era.
No question?
One thing, well, again, in my job as a moderator, just to avoid awkward silences, one of the things, Sergey, is when you were talking about numbers as well, in terms of how to measure a number, in terms of casualties and so on. One of the things that I kept remembering is the definition of Lebanese civil war, which, when you look at it, lasted from 1975 till 1990, 15 years, had 120,000 casualties. But except for the ups and downs or the epochs or the levels of intensification, it is considered to be a one long civil war. So I would like to hear more, but since we set it up, but I would like to hear more about this. I think the definition of a conflict, which includes war sometimes escalation, the conflict can escalate into war, is something to ponder about. So let's say...
No, go ahead.
No.
10 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Maybe. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me express my gratitude for this invitation. I hope that we will receive a good discussion. Frank, effective. Second, right now, I represent only myself. I don't broadcast the official viewpoint of Kremlin, Russian MFA, MGIMO University. I represent only myself. And third, I want to present my approach about this very short message. The title of our panel is A View from Russia. But I'm convinced that one of the most important occupations of any analyst is to understand the style of thinking of our counterpartners. So I try to present the West narrative, and then I will check it, and maybe we will understand that everybody lies, especially Western politicians and Western mass media. So the first level is moral. Who are the bad guys in this conflict? It's evident. We have special hashtag for this. Russians did it. Russians has the dark side. We are new barbarians from the east, and Ukrainians belongs to the side of light. Ukrainians are good guys. It's absolutely evident. The next level, formal grounds for the West cooperation with Ukraine. Formal grounds. First, any nation has the right to independently choose its foreign policy and allies. It's evident. Second, the West, the collective West, they support the principle of inviolability of borders in Europe after 1999. Reasons for Russian aggression. Putin is an imperial. And you know, Putin has the highest extent of resentment. Because Putin said, and all of us know about it, his citation, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. No, it is the fact. So that's why Putin is imperial, and Putin has the highest extent of resentment or any kind of offense, human offense, Russians, my co-citizens, are imperial. We want the blood. We want to sacrifice this conflict, sacrificed by blood, and we don't perceive the Ukraine like an independent state. Maybe you know our proverb of our imperial co-citizens, украинцы — это русские, укушенные поляками. Ukrainians are those people who would bite by Polish people. So it's any kind of incorrect Russians. There is no Ukrainian nation, there is no Ukrainian language, they are incorrect Russian. Russia's goals: destruction of Ukrainians and civil infrastructure, and second, we want to capture the Ukrainian territory, like in the case of Crimea. We took Crimea, right now we took Donbass, Zaporozhye, Kharkov, Kiev, and so on. Who is guilty? It's evident. Russia started the war in 2022. Russia has already captured the territory of Ukraine in 2014. And the West and NATO sincerely wanted to negotiate with Russia. But Russia didn't want to do it. So Russia destroyed the negotiations, and Russia brought the war closer. So let's check this narrative. First, formal grounds. Any country has the right to protect its own national interests. And in all our doctrines, foreign policy doctrines, I mean, we always write the expansion of the NATO is a real threat to Russian national interests, always. And Russia has always a strictly defined attitude towards NATO. NATO is our enemy, and it is absolutely permanent position of Russian foreign policy. So I have the question: the principle of inviolability of the borders, really? I list several cases. For example, the most interesting for you is Russia in 1999, because Russia, sometimes I remember Russia was not actor, but was subject concerning other actors. And maybe remember our Chechnya case, and the West didn't give us a unique position and united position concerning Chechnya. For one part of the West, Chechnya was a terrorist item. For other politicians from the West, Chechnya was the place of rebels. And maybe remember the Lord Judd. He was a special official of the West, and he always said about Russian democracy. For us, it was a case of terrorism, but for the West, it was a case of any changes in the sphere of political regime. And Putin was really right when he said that the Kosovo case is real box of Pandora. Putin said in 2008, please don't open.
2006.
2006.
Yes, in his press conference.
Okay, 2006. Don't open this box. Mass consciousness. Is Putin in peril? One citation. This is a huge tragedy about the fall of the Soviet Union, but we have another citation. Anyone who doesn't regret the collapse of the Soviet Union has no heart. Some person who wants to restore it has no brains. I know that Putin has heart and brain. So the first terms of Putin, his first terms, was the time of, it was real attempts of Russia to incorporate the West. Not only in the sense of values, but also in the sense of institutions. And right now it is absolutely crazy phrase and crazy question, but Putin asked General Secretary Robertson in 2001 when Russia will be a member of the NATO. It was 2001. Russians are not imperials. Right now I want to change my identity, professional identity, and I want to say to you like sociologist, we have a huge project of Russian mass consciousness research. Of course we know imperial people with imperial values, and part of Russian, of my co-citizens, wants to restore empire. Soviet empire or Russian empire and so on. But they are minorities. Majority of my co-citizens don't want to restore the empire. We don't want to conquer and to grab and to capture another territories, because we are not so small country. We know about it. Russia's goals about shelling of civil infrastructure. Of course, I know about these tragedies when Russian missiles shot down by missile defenses, but we have no this goal to destroy civil infrastructure on Ukraine. And we was not going to annex these territories. Maybe you can remember Who can remember the first title of the People Republic? It was no Donbass. It was not Donetsk, it was not Lugansk. Who remember the first title of the People Republic in 2014? Nobody?
No rush.
No. Kharkov. The first People Republic was the People Republic of Kharkov. But when Kharkov leaders of this People Republic went to Russia and they asked, please, we want to realize our choose for separatism, for secession, they had no support from Russian officials. Like sociologists, it was any kind of resentment which was formed in Donbass. I and my team, we carry out field research on Donbass mass consciousness, and people from Donbass always ask me, always. It was a very simple question. Why don't you join us to Russia? Why don't you integrate us to Russia? And they always add the phrase, it's a very important phrase. Why don't you join us to Russia like Crimea? Because the case of Peninsula was really maybe holy symbol for them. It was the symbol of the any kind of hope. And it was not Russian goal of Russian officials to take Donbass, to grab Donbass, to join Donbass to Russia. We had, in principle, another goal: to box up Donbass to the Ukrainian state body. Maybe you remember Mr. Surkov. And Surkov was the highest Russian official who boxes up the Donbass to change Ukraine.
Time is up. Please wrap up. Time is up.
So,
We agreed 10 minutes. So.
okay. Right now we have two goals. First, suppressing the military infrastructure of Ukraine. And second, to prevent shelling of Russian territory. I have a lot of information. This is QR code for your gadgets. Please use your gadgets and scan this QR code. It is our report about Russian mass consciousness. You can find it in my Telegram channel. Please subscribe.
Great. Can you go back to the previous slide, please, if you don't have anything after that?
Just a second.
Okay.
1 minute, please.
Sure.
We have two mistakes of perception, we and the West. Our first mistake: we didn't put on the paper Western promises, don't expand the NATO, because these promises were created by Hans-Dietrich Genscher and James Baker to Gorbachev and Shevardnadze. Because you don't remember Shevardnadze, he was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union. The most important mistake of perception of the US and the collective West, right now they perceive themselves like unique winner in the Cold War. That's why they perceive Russia like loser. And that's why they try to expand the NATO. The expansion of NATO is the main threat for Russia. And the war between Russia and the West, the war between Russia and between Ukraine, the main reason of this war is the case and the question of security. We don't want to destroy the Ukraine and Ukrainian citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexei. One of the things at the beginning of every semester I tell students is that if you have something to say, unlike what you think, professors can't read minds, so you have to articulate. And I think this is one of the other issues in international relations, where countries, people, individuals assume that the other side understands or knows what they're talking about. So perceptions is Hedley Bull, I think, Conceptions and Misconceptions in International Relations. Has a very interesting book about this in terms of that. But one of the other things in terms of the lexicon that we use, for those of you who are a Star Wars fan, there is a very interesting line where one character tells the other, only a Sith, only a Dark Lord deals in absolute, when he was given the option, you're either with me or you're against me. So absolutism is, I think, one of the problems in lexicon when it comes to IR. We're the good guys, you're the bad guys. And this can work in both ways. This is in no way specifying Russia or the West. And a couple of other things from Alexei's sort of presentation is, it reminded me of Hiram Johnson, who was a U.S. congressman from California in 1945. He said, the first victim, the first casualty when a war erupts is the truth. And when you're in war, then a lot of narratives start changing and adapting and trying to articulate a goal, which brings to the issue of Karl von Clausewitz, who is on his book, War. He did talk about a war only can happen. One of the things is that you have to have clear goals. And honestly, we can discuss this, I'm inserting my comment here in a way, is that as of now, the goals are not clear as to when this war would end. In a sense that there are no clearly described, generic terms. We're going to get rid of enemies. I'm not talking about this. That's not a specific goal. And that could end up going on. The war can go on perpetually. And this is probably a concern for someone who studies the region or others who study the region, that there are no clearly defined goals that when Ukraine or Russia achieve, then they would say, we achieved our goal. Like the U.S. did with Iraq, very prematurely, right? Victory, the famous image with George Bush on a warship saying, we brought victory in 2003, 2004, 2005. But these are some things that I think we're going to come back to. And thanks, Alexei, for talking about the perceptions of the perceptions, in a way, if we want to talk about it, and providing an attitude or the look or the view from a Russian specialist. And by the way, when we say Russians think this and so on, it's a bit naive, right? Yeah. You cannot say all Armenians drink. I don't drink, or all Russians drink. So in a way, it has to be clarified as to the perception, as to, are we talking about policymakers? Are we talking about which policymakers? Are there cliques in policymaking family? So I think generalization is also problematic. The Russians think like this. The Ukrainians think like this.
Definitely this type of groupism, right?
Yeah.
That we feel is that we're guilty of many times.
Exactly. Sorry. Your turn.
Shall I self-introduce myself?
I introduced at the beginning.
Yeah. No, thank you for having me, for giving me the floor, Aspet, and thank you for inviting me to this event. I think this is exactly what a high-quality academic institution should do, right? To serve its mission and to cater to its student population various views, which sometimes we can agree, sometimes we can disagree, but I think the bottom line expectation is that these views are grounded in research. And from here, I think, this speculation whether we should be frank, we shouldn't be frank, is
always frank. When in doubt, always go
goes
frank.
to the sides, because if your evaluation is based on research, which is what we're trying to do in this university in our classrooms, then due to that, it is also being objective. And before I really begin, and I had to restructure a lot of what I was going to say, following the arguments offered by my colleagues, some of it reminded me of this. You all know probably this expression very often attributed to Plato about the truth and his teacher, right? My favorite part of it is the iteration by Aristotle about both Socrates and Plato, where he basically said that both friendship and truth are dear to me, but I have the sacred duty of giving preference to truth and to research and to some objective facts. So we are more than 14 months into this war in Ukraine, and I look forward to our follow-up discussion on where it started and how it started and whatsoever. But following this 14 months into the war, Russia, the superpower, has secured the gains that Russia has secured are not as impressive as it would have been by a war launched by a superpower. But the meantime, the human toll of this war is huge, and I want to really underline from the very beginning that the human toll of it for all of us as social scientists creates this emotional layer that we probably have to keep in mind. I mean, this war continues, and there has been a lot of war. We know war. We teach war, but we also know what is called unnecessary evil, right? Photos of Mariupol these days. I mean, it just hurts, and all that stuff. In my understanding, that being said, in my understanding, the war, and Sergei touched about it briefly, it was launched by Russia, I believe, most likely due to certain miscalculations. I believe it was really meant to be kept within the logic of special military operation. And by the actions of the Russian military that we can, from the very beginning a year ago to, track down, it was meant to, take over Kiev, orchestrate a regime change, and, from that perspective, probably the purposes of the special military operation would have been achieved, and that would have secured the Russian border. But that has failed, and that dragged Russia into more prolonged military conflict. And in some ways, this is a prelude for my students, those of us attending, to our following Friday's class on Russian foreign policy making topic. But these conversations about Russia and Russia-Ukraine will always remind me of a wonderful book written by Angus Roxburgh, I think in 2013 or 14. For those of you unaware of this gentleman from Brussels, he used to be employed by the Kremlin in early 2000s, remember him? Who later wrote a book. He was a PR consultant essentially, and later he wrote a book with a lot of interviews with top policymakers in Russia, including Sergei Ivanov, Igor Ivanov, President Putin himself, a number of big names really in Russian political elite, and they're all of them. And this was published after the Georgia War, 2008, which I will touch upon later. There, everyone says that type of war that we have witnessed with Georgia is not going to happen with Ukraine because we are relatives. There are so many connections on family level, on various levels, that this is unthinkable. But then, really things happened. Obviously, and we can discuss this, Russia launched this war because it has long had concerns about NATO buildup on its frontiers. It's clearly the case. But as I said, the war is, I think, a result of miscalculations. partly due to poor communications between various branches of power in the Russian government, which I think is evident. My favorite example is this photo posted by Maria Zakharova on the 16th of February 2022, which was the date when the CIA probably expected the war to erupt. It didn't. It only happened a week later. And there, the caption of the photo on the social network was that something like the ministers talking, having a working meeting, but the war has not begun, unlike what Western intelligence has predicted. Which did either of the two. Either it has put these two very well-respected ministers of the Russian government in an uncomfortable position, or the foreign ministry below the ministerial level was really uninformed that there is going to be a war. Obviously, some of the Russian ambassadors abroad, including Anatoly Antonov in Washington, D.C., was also quoted in one of the cable networks in the States, where he said that it's not going to happen, we're not crazy or something. That's what he said. Our colleagues have very eloquently, I think, described the magnitude of Russian humiliation, and correct me if that is wrong, since 1991, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this has been a narrative, this issue has been, I think, dramatically overlooked by the Western policymakers. The magnitude of Russian humiliation following the collapse of the Soviet Union, which triggered this economic crisis throughout the former Soviet Union area, but particularly in Russia. And obviously, and I think Alexei also mentioned about Chechnya. Chechnya is sort of the shorthand to explain how this humiliation was, completely disregarded by Western institutions, Western politicians, when they were using this war in North Caucasus. And Sergei is one of the best experts on North Caucasus, of whom I know. Maybe you want to speak about it, Sergei, later. That they were using Chechnya as a tool to further undermine Russia, further weaken Russia, which was obviously, building up a lot of humiliation. But then, something that is very often being disregarded is 9/11. We all know, at least my students do, that the Russian president was the first to call Bush, following the terrorist attack in New York and other places, and that. That new agenda of the U.S. administration, fight against terrorism and all that stuff, began a period of rapprochement between Russia and the United States, and that allowed for not very easy, but allowed for more cooperative bilateral relations in the next 2 years. Right, that's between September, October 2001, and around February 2003, when it is already clear that Americans, together with the Brits and a coalition of other partners, were planning to go and invade Iraq, which, began to build up on the humiliation of the 1990s, and then the peak of this process is probably the Munich Security Conference 2007, which is some 18 months later, followed by the 5-day war in Georgia. The tenure of Dmitry Medvedev was again an attempt to, make relations more cooperative. It didn't work as many would have wished, and then. After a brief period of build-up, we see 2014 Crimea, which was, if you look at it from the perspective of 2022 or 2023, the annexation of Crimea, or whatever is the label that you want to put, was not very heavily criticized by the EU or the United States. I'm not comparing it to the consequences of the ongoing war, but there were some sanctions, some criticism, but there was this, you were talking earlier about primordialism, there was this sense that, a drunk guy gave Crimea to Ukrainians in 1950s. Thank God there are no casualties now. Fine, it's Russia. But then neither side was flexible enough between 2014 and 2022 to give space to negotiations. Now, why was this the case? We can have. I didn't know that there is any reliable sociologist. Thank you for pointing it out, Alexei. But at least in the frameworks of an academic establishment, and this is probably the last word that I want to put in, but we can have two kind of layers of analysis. Either we go to either we embrace the IR theories, which Professor Mersheimer, probably you're right, is very much loved in Armenia too. Either we are going to embrace the IR theories, and say that neoliberalism and all that stuff, it doesn't justify, but it explains why great powers behave the ways that they behave. Or we can try to embrace, what is my favorite choice, some tools offered by foreign policy analysis and say that, it's all about leadership. It's not about the features of the international system. It's not about the features of world order that, makes one leader to prefer war and make another leader to prefer peace or reconciliation or diplomacy. But at least in my view, in the frameworks of academic establishments, there are these two kind of tracks. Either theories or my favorite, leadership analysis or, discussions of why war, if we're talking about Ukraine, is the choice of of some leaders and not the others. Unfortunately, the war will be going on for a while. It may also, go bigger with the pattern of escalation that we are seeing today. So probably we as experts have this social duty of, with historical parallels and whatnot, explaining, what is the future that this will bring and what is the future that we want to avoid, we want the policymakers to avoid.
Thank you, Ovannes.
Thank you.
The panel discussion that we had on the breakup the day after the war. The day after the war broke up, Ovannes was on it as an IR expert. We also had Varam as a historian, and it was quite interesting to see, the clash sometimes about explaining issues from an IR theory, very classic sort of academic perspective versus learning from history. And going back to what you said, Alexei, it's quite interesting that when you were talking about the Eastern Ukraine population, they're looking at Crimea. It's by default, Russia, and says something that Ovannes said, Russia had set a precedence with Crimea, which actually other regions started looking at. And I think precedence is important to keep in mind in IR. The couple of quick comments, and I have a couple of questions to the panel, to our guests, all participants. An empire is an empire even if it's not called one. There is, for some of you who know this or don't, the U.S. has always said or advocated for American exceptionalism. We cannot be an empire because we're not like others. Well, guess what? It is an empire. And they're still in denial about it, yet there is a narrative that they believe in it. And glorifying the past, or glorifying a past which is an imperial past, is in itself, it's a mindset. It shows that you're an empire, whether you like it or not. It's a bad word. You don't want to be an imperial power. Yeah, we call it whatever. We're merry-go-round a country, or whatever it is that you can think of. But in essence, by glorifying that, by glorifying and looking at the past and behavior, you are empire. Another thing that, as an IR scholars and as people observing this, falling the trap of repeating history, well, not repeating, but being limited by history, is how we compare the current conflict sometimes, and a lot of people, I would like to hear your thoughts about this as well, with the Cold War, even using the Cold War lexicon in many cases, which severely limits us, I think, in terms of understanding the new nuances, the multi-layered component that you talked about, Sergei. I can't remember where it was, somewhere in between. I had this lamp sort of turning on. It reminded me of Jean-Paul Sartre's No Exit. There's a very famous line where l'enfer c'est les autres, hell is others. And we see this between Ukrainians and Russians. We see this in so many different places, where you think and you believe, hell is other people, actually, in English translation, that in order for you, your personal hell would be what you create and whom you think that you're sharing that space with. So you constantly have that. Again, thank you all for your initial thoughts or for your initial comments. So maybe we can build upon, one of the couple of things, and I want to bring the question, a couple of small discussion also about where does the South Caucasus fall in this context, specifically Armenia, or into the Russian narrative or worldview about this.
I have a comment too.
Yeah. The first thing is about the sort of the narratives, or what I was talking about earlier, what I mentioned about earlier. What perceptions-wise. How does Russia view, in terms of, the modern or the manifestations of this, about the lexicon, about the rhetoric? Cold War, is it a Cold War? Is it revival of Cold War?
Okay.
Yeah.
Can
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. First of all, I'm not a special envoy of Kremlin or press secretary of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is why I'm not responsible for their understanding of Cold War and so on. As for my personal estimation,
Of course, that's what I meant.
I'm too skeptical to apply Cold War lexicon or Cold War system to the current events. And why?
Good.
My basic argument here: the Cold War was based on bipolar structure of the world, bipolar, with rather fixed poles, and the most important thing here is recognition of areas of responsibility. For example, Stalin has a dispute or clashes with Tito. It did not mean intervention of the West supporting Tito.
Yeah.
Let's see on events in Hungary in 1956. When did Khrushchev decided to intervene? When he talked with ambassador of the US, Mr. Bolin, Ambassador Bolin in Moscow, answering question: did you consider Hungary as your sphere of influence? And listening to no, he decided to intervene. The same scheme was in the conversation between Mr. Brezhnev and Mr. Lyndon Johnson in 1968 when Czechoslovakia appeared. No land-leases, no special equipments, weapons, and so on, and vice versa. In 1946, in both Italy and France, communists won elections for constituente.
Yeah.
It did not mean Stalin supported. Let's see civil war in Greece. Greece had one of the most influential communist parties in Europe, at least in southern part of Europe. No intervention. Moreover, divergences around Greece was one of the reasons of conflict between Stalin and Tito. This is why we recognize spheres of influence each other. And what territories became areas of confrontation? Areas not described by Yalta and Potsdam. Because some more pleasant, unpleasant gentlemen didn't think seriously about post-colonialism, anti-colonialism. In 1945, sorry, India was a part of the British Empire. as well as Algeria was a part of France. But after those countries began making their very difficult choice between the two poles, and Afghanistan, Vietnam, Cuba, Nicaragua was arenas of confrontation between the West and Russia, but not Europe. The problem of Cold War is recognition of spheres of influence. Nowadays, we have no recognition of Russia's spheres of influence in the post-Soviet space. Usually, it's so usual in Russia when we listen to criticism, we interrupted our counterpart saying, Americans did the same, we will do the same. Now I'm not going to replicate this experience. Let's see on Turkey, for example. Can we equalize attitude of Turkey to Northern Cyprus with Argentina? Of course, no. You mentioned Lebanon. For Israel, Lebanon is valuable, but not Venezuela. Not the same. This is why every country has its own sphere of influence. It's not invention of Putin, it's not invention of Stalin, and so on. It's necessary to discuss how to harmonize divergences. One point was raised here for our conversation about the right of nations, peoples to have their own geopolitical foreign policy choice. Of course, I repeated this thesis dozens of times. Yes, of course, as a scholar, as an analyst, I can recognize the right of Armenians, Azeris, Georgians, Ukrainians, Cubans, and so on for their geopolitical choice. But in this way, we should make the next logical step to recognize the Russia's right to disagree with the right of Armenians, Azeris, Georgians, Ukrainians, and so on. If United States take care about right of people to follow their own foreign policy choice, what was the question with Cuba? Please recognize their right to be communist, leftist, what else? This is why it's kind of, even not double standards, but absence of standards. Every time, every country assembles its own puzzle. One important point raised by our honorable moderator, the role of past in a reconstruction of narratives today and so on. It's kind of conventional wisdom to portray Russia as a country loving its glorious past and so on. I remember brilliantly one TV episode from CNN just day after Crimean return to safe haven or annexation, if you want. It depends on your angle of observation. I quote it now, President of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma, he said, everything is predetermined by your point of sitting, yeah? When he was party secretary of Yuzhmash, he was pro-Soviet, he was communist, and so on. In 2003, he published a book, Ukraine is not Russia. Yes, but it was also not Poland, Hungary, and Venezuela, not only Russia. But about historical past. Farid Zakharia, distinguished journalist, said, Russia every time takes care about past. I discussed this problem with my American colleagues. I said, okay, what's about Lincoln Memorial, Jefferson Memorial, Washington Memorial? They are very important for your identity. This is why Suvorov or Elizabeth or Catherine the Great were also important for our identity. However, let's see on situation in Crimea. It was not about Peter the Great or specific nostalgia about Stalin. It was about 75% of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. It was about current agenda. You can say the Black Sea Fleet is the weakest among our Russian fleets and flotillas. Yes, of course, but it played its role, maybe modest, in events of 2008, in events of Chechnya, and so on, so on. It was very important vanguard of the Russian political and security influence in the southern flank of my country now. Let's see on helicopters. Prior to 2014, some details were 100% sent by Motor Sich from Zaporizhia to our plants in Rostov-on-Don and Kazan. It was not about Stalin, sorry. It was not about our glorious past. It's about our security, our probability, opportunity to produce helicopters, to ensure our security. Let's see on equipments for transit of oil. The biggest supplier was plant in Sumy, city in the eastern part of Ukraine. Till 2018, we were dependent from this production. It was not about Stalin. It was not about Russian imperial or Soviet past. It was about current necessities. What we see now in Russia it's a problem. By the way, I can recognize it. We see a gap between our real interests and PR promotion. We have very poor PR promotion. It's a problem because we quote Peter the Great or Stalin or somebody else, not paying attention to the current problems, real challenges existing today. And one more point, last not the least in this round, I address to my good friend Avanes, who said I was negatively impressed by destructed buildings in Mariupol and so on. I know Mariupol very well. I was born in Rostov-on-Don. My first trip to Donbass was paid at the age of 3. My first visit to Moscow was at the age of 13. My first to St. Petersburg was at the age of 25. It helped us to explain my imaging geography. I was in Georgia, Lithuania, Ukraine earlier than I first time was in Moscow. It's my personal estimate. I traveled to Mariupol practically every week with my dad, who was deputy of captain in fisherman ship in Klaipėda in Lithuania. However, he had special checks for Mariupol. There was only one store in southern part of the USSR for those checks. And I traveled to Mariupol. It was specific city with port style, little bit different from average parts of European part of the former USSR. And for me, it's a personal tragedy. I perceive the tragedy of Donbass as my own because I was a frequent West there. And my native city, Rostov-on-Don, was connected with this area. However, being disappointed, being impressed by all those destructions, we should not miss destructions in Donbass. Because I am editor-in-chief of Journal of International Analytics. Please, I strongly recommend it, please. It's open. I would be more than happy to see you like authors of my journal. I publish Georgian authors, Polish authors, Norwegian after 2025. If you want, if you demonstrate your, how to say, game on the light side of the history, no, it's not my interest. But if you want to submit something, please, we will consider. However, and some of my members of editorial board rejected their membership after 2022 events, saying that, Sergei, we regret, but we saw pictures of Mariupol, Kiev. Guys, where you were when buildings of Donetsk and Luhansk were shot for 8 years. We never raised your voice. I know all of my members. No publications about it. No publications about criminal activities of so-called volunteers, battalion of Ukrainians and so on. Okay, you can say Russia is not right, it's wrong, yeah, but in this way we should recognize shared responsibility. Otherwise, sorry, your selective compassion looks like fake.
Thank you, Sergey. And I would ask the both of you to limit, I mean, without going too far, because we're not going to have enough discussion and we won't be able to take questions. And again, you preempted me. That's the problem, right? This is the problem where historical examples or narratives come up, and no one freaking expresses that the reason why we're doing this is that or this. And then, of course, the interpretation is left to people. And then, of course, we know people are not, in general, and I have to say this also, are not the smartest bunch in the sharpest tool in the shed. And people have conspiracy theories. Of course, they're going to listen to the historical narrative, even though you might not be clear about this. So, from this perspective, it's important to also keep in mind the lack of clarity. I will ask you both just briefly to comment. But specifically, maybe Alexei, you might want to talk about the narrative. And I didn't mean that you speak on behalf of, or anyone can speak. I barely speak on behalf of myself. But in terms of having the issue of, really, is there a narrative coming out of Russian policymakers about comparing this to the Cold War, the lexicon that is used for people who have lived the Cold War? Is it the same? Are they comparing it? Even if it's not bipolar, you presented the whole thing. But so, Alexei, and again, each one, please, just 3-4 minutes each, so that we can collect questions from the.
Sorry for my monopoly.
That's fine. That's fine. That's fine.
this is not the Cold War because the Western weapon killed my co-citizens on Ukraine. My officers, my soldiers. This is not Cold War.
I'm not talking about if it is or not. The rhetoric I'm talking about.
I don't want to come to this. I was really surprised by your speech because you didn't mention our trip to Mariupol 3 weeks ago. Maybe it will be my pass to the next story. So my accurate pass to you, to your next story, it will be the case of Ambassador Bill Burns. So I have the sentence. I have 2 points to organize. First point, mistake of perception. Bill Burns, right now he is the chief of CIA, and he was ambassador, American ambassador in Moscow. And I want to address maybe to the students first of all. Please find the address of Bill Burns, number 265. 265 address of Bill Burns to the center. It is situated on wikileaks.com. It names Нет means Нет. Нет значит нет. The NATO enlargement, the red lines of NATO enlargement, maybe Ukraine NATO enlargement. So, and Burns mentioned that all his counterparts, oppositional, official counterparts from NGOs, all his vis-a-vis mentioned that the NATO expansion, it is real threat to Russia. That's why I understand that Mr. Burns really understands our threats and Russian policy. Mr. Burns has no mistakes of perception. And my second point is about sociology. One of the main difficulties for Russian propaganda is perception of this war. Because if you want to realize good war, you should hate your enemy. But due to our research, we understand that Russians don't hate Ukrainians. Ukrainians right now hate us. We hate Ukrainian president, or we despair him, but we don't perceive Ukrainians like, it is the case about relatives, about links of brotherhood and so on. We don't perceive Ukrainians like another. It is the sense of any kind of policy and war, according to Carl Schmitt. The sense of politics is separation on we and they. We have no this kind of separation due to Ukrainian conflict right now. That's why it is the biggest difficulty for Russian propaganda. That's why we perceive at the sense of mass consciousness this war like special military operation. Because we have no the image of enemy. Ukrainians for us are not enemy. Ukrainian government is enemy. So that is my point.
I would just tell my students that don't really waste your time on finding Bill Burns' memo, because I have it on my slides next week. Okay, that was sent in April 2008 when he was the president, when he was the ambassador to Moscow. And you're completely right, by the way, that he very rarely makes mistakes. I have the privilege of meeting him a few times in the past, and that's exactly because he was the head of CIA in 2022 that the Americans did not make a mistake in predicting that there will be an all-out war.
1 week.
I mean, it happens. Very quickly, Sergei, I am not, and I have never been in favor of canceling Tchaikovsky. That's not smart. I mean, for the sake of academic discussion in universities and for the sake of informed discourse, that's not a smart thing to do. And I never supported such views, and I never do. But I also have done my homework in the past years and have carefully, to the extent possible, followed the developments in the unrecognized statelets in the east of Ukraine. And I know exactly what was going on between 2014 22. That can barely be defined by any rule of law. That is going to be a headache for Russia if the war ends with Russian soldiers standing in the east. There will be a lot of investment required for winning the hearts and minds of the people in those territories, and I'm sure that you know. Very quickly on the Cold War aspect, I echo my colleagues almost 100% that this is not Cold War. All the reasons that Sergei has, all the historical facts that Sergei has listed, plus there is no ideological divide. Right? There is no ideal.
Just a clarification.
Consumerism on both sides.
All three of you missed the question. I'm not saying if it's similar to Cold War. I'm just saying lexicon-wise, are people using Cold War lexicon or not? That's the main thing, because by doing so, you limit your sort of perceptions and you base it on a structure of a Cold War mentality. That was the goal. Sergei provided a very good background. Alexei avoided the question, didn't want to, and then you're also doing the same thing. But do you see that the lexicon that you see used in the Cold War?
If you allow me to add in the second sentence.
Yes.
First, ideology. But the second one, which Sergei, I think, very eloquently underlined, 1945, 1991, or 1989, depending on how you count, was not about redrawing the world order. It was defined in Yalta and Potsdam. Right? Now, I think, all this war, and given how many nations are really involved in the war, from the Ukrainian side against Russia, this war is going to alter the world order. Cold War was not meant to be altering the world order. I mean, you know the story. Just for the students here, Cold War was all about proxy wars. Be that in Korea, Vietnam. And there may be a legitimate question whether this is the Vietnam for Russia. But this war is going to change the world order for a few reasons, one of which is that Russia is all in. Defeat, and I'm not going even to define what defeat may mean for Russia or victory for the West. There is no scenario, I think, in current Russian thinking where there will be no regime change in Ukraine. No change in the foreign policy behavior of the government in Ukraine within the boundaries of 1991. If the boundaries change, then things may change. But how do we feel this world order shift in the region of South Caucasus? And I want to make this relevant also for our region. It just so happens, and our faculty members in attendance will testify, same as our guests. It just so happens that Russia, once in a century, decides to build up cordial relationships with Turkey. In the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, we witnessed Russia-Turkey entente or rapprochement, or new type of relations, which had very decisive effects on the ground in the South Caucasus. Now we see exactly the same. Whether we know how the first attempt ended, right? The first attempt ended probably by early 1930s, probably. I think Professor Termatovisan may chip in here. By early 1930s, it was evident that it's not working, and following the World War II, obviously Turkey joined NATO. Now it's not clear exactly to how far these two nations will go, but it is clear that so far their entente is built on, at the expense, rather I should say, of Syrians, and at the expense of Armenians in the region.
And I hope the questions we'll have will be about this.
Yeah.
We're already out of time. Diplomatic faux pas that Sergei alluded to as well, there are a lot. Even though we're launching a new degree, International Relations and Diplomacy, and we're not going to teach students how not to do things. Well, hopefully we will. But, one of the more famous faux pas was 1991 U.S. Ambassador April Gillespie in Iraq. When Iraq, Saddam Hussein decided that he's going to invade Kuwait, her response was that, well, the U.S. is not interested in Arab conflict, which they took as, okay, go ahead and invade, which was a miscommunication. So this is one of the other things about communication, lexicon, and faux pas in terms of what the right person being in the right place. So we should also be careful about generalization. I would like to open the floor for questions. I will collect some of them. And again, our session was supposed to be until 4:30, although we have the room a bit longer than that. So we'll do that. So let me, 1, 2, 3 questions, 4 questions. Let's start with the first round.
So, Mr. Nicolasen, when you were talking about Cold Wars, you mentioned proxy wars. Can we refer to the war in Ukraine as a proxy war?
Okay, good.
Russia?
Good question. I'm going to collect the questions, and then we can all answer. The panel could answer.
Thank you, professors, for this interesting discussion. My question is the following. You regularly refer to NATO expansion that, which I perceive to pose a security issue in Russia, which made the war inevitable. If it's not that Russia's President Vladimir Putin has imperialist ambitions and wants to conquer Ukraine, but because of NATO expansion, then the invasion of Ukraine did not stop NATO expansion. A few days ago, Finland joined the alliance. What's the difference? Why Russia did not invade Finland?
Thank you. I'm Arman Abdullah, first year PSI student. I have 2 questions. First of all, you have already mentioned that U.S. ambassador in Russia sent a message to U.S. and say that all the Russian elites, Ukraine is a red line for all Russian elites. While war is going on and 14 more months passed, is the unity of all the Russian elites becoming fragile while war is going? And the second one, what is the role of China in this conflict, especially after the visit of Xi Jinping to Moscow? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Good points.
I don't have question, actually. Since it was a view from Russia, I think it would be fair to present some views from the United States briefly. So I can do that maybe after our guest from Moscow will answer the questions.
Yes, afterwards, once we...
from Armenia.
Well... Do you have any connections with the U.S. that you were not aware of, Arsen?
I do.
Okay. We all do, right? We're at the American University. Yes, so let's look at that. So the issue of Cold War proxy, is the current war as can it be viewed as a proxy? NATO expansion, Finland, China. We're going to go for the second round.
China and fragility of the Russian elites, within Russian elites.
Yes, fragility.
Can we treat these fragilities?
So very briefly, I mean, again, I will give you the order. We'll keep the order. Sergei, and whichever the question you want to answer, just about a minute or so that we can gather
Maybe
more.
now we should change
Switch?
switch. Yeah.
Alexei, we'll come with you.
Think about China. It's very good plan for all the best, but it's the most inconcrete plan. there is no any good things for all of actors in this conflict. All the best plan. And of course, China is one of the leaders at this moment of the world order, but I want to emphasize that it is only my opinion, but of course we cannot call China like Russian ally, only like strategic partner, because Russia won't cross the border due to conflict on Taiwan, and China doesn't perceive the conflict on Ukraine like the sphere of Chinese national interests. We are friends, and our president, Mr. Putin, always said that our relations with China has the highest extent in the history, but it doesn't mean that China is our ally. Very good plan. China belongs to us. Very good plan.
Okay. Hovhannes, would you care to comment?
I do care a lot. That's an excellent question about Ukraine being a proxy war or not. I have to think about this more, okay? But my quick response would be the following, okay? Let's not forget we are in a university. There should be three, in the proxy wars during the Cold War, there have been probably all of them satisfy the three following criteria, right? Or can be judged about based on the following criteria: geography, participants, and the role of the superpower. In terms of geography, the proxy wars of the Cold War were taking place outside of the spheres of influence, as Dr. Markedonov has mentioned, defined in Yalta. Okay? Ukraine, I think, clearly in many ways, in every ways, is a territory important for Russia. In terms of participants, all the wars, all the proxy wars during the Cold War, the superpowers were involving on behalf of one of the two factions inside a country. I am having very hard time now in 2023, or this second round of conflict in Ukraine, to identify what is the second party really in Ukraine. Although I see many arguments that the statelets in the East are actors on their own, which I think is almost unbelievable. Yeah, maybe this much. Maybe 2014 conflict in the East would have qualified for a proxy war better, but probably not this one. Probably not this one. Yeah, thank you.
This is also an opportunity for us as IR scholars sometimes to come up with new definitions instead of proxy war or something else, because it really is challenging to use that. Sergey, about the fracture of the elite.
Okay, let me link the two issues, elites, fragility, absence of fragility maybe.
Briefly though, please.
Briefly, I will try. And question of Finland,
yes.
Ukraine, these trends.
That's a lot.
Okay, a lot, yeah, I understand. As for elites, I suppose many people make really serious mistake identifying Russian foreign policy with one personality. It's understandable, it's clear that the role of this person is important and significant. Sometimes Putin ensures key role in decision making. However, Hovhannes, as far as I remember, quoted Putin in Munich. But please address the Yeltsin speech in Budapest OSCE summit in December 1994 and then Istanbul summit of OSCE in 1999. Practically everything was borrowed by Putin in Munich 2007. It's a mistake saying that the problem is in Putin. Maybe I am saying now something extremist or opportunist. If Mr. Navalny will be president of Russia, problem of NATO and its enlargement will be in agenda as the most important challenge. Because it's one thing to be in opposition and other thing is to be leader of the country.
I'm right.
Moreover, Alexei Navalny is more nationalistic. And Alexei Navalny is liking himself most of all. 2 points which will exaggerate the problems between NATO and Russia in the future. Question about Finland. I understand that many people joke now about why Russia is not going to attack Finland, but everything is simple. Since 2004, when 3 Baltic countries became NATO members, Russia said, former USSR area is not area for NATO enlargement, because its territory, this territory was perceived like priority interest zone, not Finland. We understood prior to 2004, 2014, 2020, 2022 that Finland was a part of the West. Finland was estimated in different ways. It's necessary to take it into account, not portraying Russia like irrational power, crazy and so on and so on. It has its own logics. These logics could be ignored, could be missed, however, it should be taken into the account. And one last not least comment about offer to provide the American viewpoint following the Roman principle audiatur et altera pars. I suppose that American narrative and American viewpoint is represented well, unlike Russian. The key problem for foreign relations, at least for last 30 years, is ignoring, misunderstanding the Russian viewpoint. Russia wants only one thing. Russia should be in, not like in Lotus May principles. USA in, Germany down, Russia out. Sorry, the biggest European country in the world is Russia. Moscow is the biggest European city. Allow Russia to be in, not out.
And we have the tendency to think that the U.S. has one foreign policy, whereas there are a lot of centers of foreign policy making, like many other places in the U.S., as Department of State, Department of Defense, and so on. So, yes, let's get a second round of questions. One, and this will be probably the last one. So, yes, Axel, 2, 3, 4. Anyone in my back? No. So let's.
Let me do my comments, and that would provoke more interesting discussion.
But we don't have time for more and 5. Let's start with Axel, and then move around. Yes, go ahead, Axel.
So in France, a lot of military experts and geopolitical experts are saying, as Dr. Nicholson said, that the war was not meant to last for more than 2 weeks, and that's due to like 1 year of military operation, slow and costly advances. They will foster Finland 1940 war.
The Winter War.
And I would like to have your opinion on that.
Okay. So about the the perceptions that the war would have lasted shorter, or 2 weeks, and then it ended up being longer, and then the analogy with the Winter War in 1940. Go ahead. Yes,
okay.
And then.
If it's possible, my question will be personal for Mr. Tokarev. Because you said that Russia wasn't willing to annex the territories of Kherson, Zaporozhye, and so on. So, how to explain that now the territory of Russia is bigger for republics if Putin is not an imperialist, if the territory is not enough
okay, I've got it. Good question.
Was it immediate action or I don't know?
Okay. No.
Here people talk about great powers and so on. If I may, I would like to narrow down the question to Armenia. What's going on in Nagorno-Karabakh? Well, it's evident that with the start of the war in Ukraine, Azerbaijan took it as a chance to tighten its policy. And now we have this 100 and more days of blockade, terror and everything. Actually, of course, it was not the way we would like to have it, the situation, but the fact that we have peacekeepers, Russian peacekeepers. I would like to ask the experts, is it how the peacekeeping mission was supposed to be carried on? Because if I'm not mistaken, since 2016, the issue of placement of peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh was raised by Russia. So I just wonder, and in general, from your perspective as a Russian scientist, political scientist, what expectations can we have in these developments for our country?
So the impact, I'm just repeating for the microphone, so the impact of the Ukraine war on the mission, of the Russian peacekeeping mission in Nagorno-Karabakh.
All in all, the worsening of situation in Karabakh.
Yeah. You had your hand up?
Yes, but it's another student.
They did? Who had their hand up?
No.
Okay, that's you, and then we'll have that.
Question about kind of reflexivity of Russian foreign policy, right? You spoke about kind of territories of influence. And you, Alexei, spoke about you lumped together Kosovo, Srpska Krajina, which I am both Serbian and from Srpska Krajina, which are very different in terms of federal structure, in terms of the dissolution of Yugoslavia. But then also you talk about kind of Putin in your discussion and kind of the R2P as a Pandora's box, Kosovo as a Pandora's box. And actually then later on Putin also kind of referring to the protection of Russians in Ukraine. Isn't he actually the one who is opening Pandora's box? That would be my first question. And the second one is about actually these spheres of influence. Is Russia, and this is the reflexivity question, shouldn't it ask itself, why is it losing its sphere of influences? For example, Serbia now with Kosovo, Serbia put in a really bad position. In how do we react to Ukraine and Russia given this issue? Also, Armenia in quite a similar position with Azerbaijan, in a weaker position than it was given what is happening in Ukraine, Russia's focus elsewhere. And is the question really now, what is Russia not doing with its historical strategic partners? Why is it failing? Why is it failing?
Professor Uroš Trokic he teaches here full-time, as is Professor Arsen Gasparian, who's an adjunct. So we have a lot of faculty members here. Very briefly, and then Arsen also very briefly.
Yeah.
В основополагающем акте России и НАТО стороны договорились не рассматривать друг друга как противников.
Could you ask the question in English, please, because there could be in an English
time question.
Okay.
In Russian NATO document, sides not considered each other as enemies. If war in Ukraine is war with NATO, or NATO's expansion is enemy act for Russia, why Sergei Lavrov is against for cancelling that document?
Thank you. And Arsen, exactly 1 minute, if that's possible.
Please, because this is important for our students also understand this point of view, because choosing, first of all, I would like to thank our guest from Moscow. And choosing war is the most important policy decision Washington makes on behalf of the American people. War profoundly affects domestic policy in the United States and also domestic economy. Yet the last time American voters compelled to fundamental policy shift away from war was in 1968, when President Nixon promised to end the Vietnam War, the Vietnam conflict, and devise an honorable exit. In November 2024, American voters must choose again. Will Americans continue to support this escalating proxy war? And yes, Evelina left, this is, in my view, is a proxy war in Ukraine, or will Americans demand to protect American borders, to maintain the republic that upholds the rule of law and respect other cultures and traditions, different cultures and traditions outside of the United States, and protect American citizens, American commerce, and prosperity. And when I'm saying to protect border, I mean, the focus of this administration, unfortunately, is not on metastasizing cancer of criminality and huge business of drug cartels on the Rio Grande, which forms more than 1,200 miles of segment of U.S.-Mexican border. Unfortunately, their focus is on Ukraine. The Vietnam War sobered up the American electorate, but after the victory in 1991, many American presidents blurred this distinction between war and peace. And now this reckless pursuit of global military hegemony inspired interventions, and many American administrations committed American soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines to endless interventions in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Balkans, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and U.S. share of global GDP fell from 40% in 1960 to 24% in 2022. And in the end, I would like to paraphrase Bob Gates. I'm sure many of you remember he served many years in CIA and served also a defense secretary in Bush and Obama administrations. He said that any American president or any American policymaker who is willing to risk a high-end conventional war with Russia should have his head examined, or minimum, he has serious psychiatric care issues. So this applies, I think, today to those policymakers who want to engage in nuclear brinkmanship with Russia. So these are my comments. You asked 2 minutes. I did.
Actually had 3 minutes.
Okay, got it.
You used 3 minutes. Okay, as a final round, please again keep it brief. But I would like to start with. Actually, I want to keep you at the end because I want to also within your sphere of knowledge, I think the question about the impact of the Russian peacekeepers, but anything else as well. So the first question, and I would alternate between Alexei and Hovhannes. So we have the issue of the 2 weeks war. What is the, it was supposed to be 2 weeks and ended up being longer. So how is that explained? Maybe Alexei. Also, we had the issue of annexation as a symbol or as a benchmark, if you want to call it. And also, why are they losing their spheres of influence?
I want to
Alexei?
the second question.
Yeah?
It's a very good question. Very good and deep question. But I've seen the high extent of simplification when you try to insist me a stereotype and maybe prejudice about that Putin is imperial. It's very high extent of simplification. Not only the situation in general, but the consciousness of Putin too. So Russian foreign policy always has very strong and deep state. We respect the sovereignty of the post-Soviet states. We give it on paper, we put it on paper in our agreement, for example, with Ukraine. We had a big agreement with Ukraine in 1997. It was a big agreement with Ukraine, agreement about friendship and strategic partnership. And Putin and Yeltsin and Medvedev always underlined that we respect the Ukrainian territorial integrity and sovereignty before 2014. Maybe they didn't remember about 1994. It was address of Sevastopol local representatives to the Russian Supreme Council. Please, we want to be a part of Russia. Please join us to This is the channel of Sergey.
Yes. Sergey's PR.
Yeah.
At least you're clear about it.
Sergey PR when I'm talking. Please join us. It was address of Sevastopol to Russian Supreme Council. But President Yeltsin answered, no. We want to support the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And so maybe it's evident, but the foreign policy changes. We have two periods in this war. First, before Istanbul negotiations. And Russia, both Ukraine, were ready to sign the agreement. And Russia and Ukraine, I mean Ukrainian elites, I mean President Zelensky, I mean office of President Zelensky, were ready to sign the agreement to stop the war at the end of March of the former year, in 2022. But after the collapse of these negotiations, we had no rules of game. Maybe you will analyze Russian foreign policy doctrine. We have absolutely absence of Transnistria, Georgia, and Karabakh. That means that we have no rules of game right now with the West. That's why, after the collapse of the negotiations in Istanbul, we received in principle another situation. And in this situation, Russian elites and Putin personally made this choice to integrate these territories inside Russia and to join these territories to Russian state body.
I've been asked by the organizers, the co-organizers, to actually wrap it up because you're going to be late, so it's not my decision. But yes. But just
have a class,
very fast. But I do want to give the final sort of voice to Sergey to talk about the peacekeepers.
Very briefly, Yeltsin, 1994, 99. Well. You were talking about his statements in the OSCE summit, Sergey. And then also Alexei mentioned Sevastopol. Sure, those are facts. But Russia of 1990s is a completely different country than Russia of 2007, where the price for oil and gas in the international market started to skyrocket after the Iraq war. Russia in the 1990s didn't have the means to answer positively to any claim, any invitation to embrace them for the people of Sevastopol. Russia didn't have the means. Russia lost the war in Chechnya in the 1990s. Russia didn't have the means. In 2007, Russia did have the means. And ever since 2007, at least till last year, Russia was accumulating the means. Just to conclude my line of reasoning, I just want to conclude with the notion that states, territorial integrity and all that stuff, we're not in a parliament, I mean, for me to make those kind of statements. But as an irresponsible IR scholar, I should say that states never have the freedom of geopolitical choice. That's not something that the states have, right? Small states, meaning, right? The rules of the game are being dictated by great powers. And this is a great power war. I'm not sure this is a proxy war, Arsen. We have to discuss that. But this is a great power war meant to alter the world order. And here, the very last word is that I think the question raised by Dr. Prokic is completely legitimate. We have to, or probably those in Moscow, have to ask themselves why they are losing in many different fronts. and South Caucasus, and I'm triggering Sergei to elaborate more in his closing remarks, Russia is also losing in the South Caucasus. Azerbaijan is never going to be a faithful ally to Russia. Thank you.
Thank you. I think from now on, I think IR should stand for irresponsible rather than international relations. That would make our the name of our major a bit difficult. Sergei, I would also specifically, you can again finalize, but specifically about the peacekeepers, but also Urosh's question about...
Yeah.
I know, very limited.
A lot of things, yeah,
yes,
a lot of limits. Maybe I can consider this situation like one more invitation, you know. For the second, third round, I would be happy to discuss, to be engaged in the real discussion, hard discussion, yeah. In order to decrease my time, I will address to my Telegram channel. I regularly, on the regular basis, consider those questions about Russian peacekeepers, Russian positions in the Caucasus, and so on, and the role of my country in the regional and international things. Moreover, one more advertising. Just today, public TV of Armenia will translate my conversation with Petros Kazanyan, with Petros. It was rather hard. And especially you should follow my final part of this discussion. It will be interesting. As for losing and peacekeeper,